Alrighty. Well, as you can see, tonight's lecture will be on the fifth century of Armenian church history. And I don't know how many of you were confused or lost or thought that the fourth century was complicated. I can promise you, in comparison, it is a cakewalk. The fifth century is very confused. There's a lot of moving parts. And a lot of various momentous events happening all at once and overlapping with each other, as we'll see. So we'll just jump right in. So first, let me share my screen. Okay, one moment. All right, Alex, can we see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, so now I believe earlier today, an email was sent out with this leader chart, similar to the one from last week. But again, I'll just go through it very, very quickly. But you have it now, and you can consult it at your leisure. So obviously, we can see that the situation of the fifth century was a little bit, well, in certain areas of the world, it was just as crazy. A lot of leaders changing position very quickly. That hasn't changed, and it seems just to have spread across the world this time. So we can see, um, well, for example, for the Armenian patriarch Saint Sahag Bartev, in the footnote, he's the great 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 grandson of Saint Gregory. During his tenure, as we shall see, he was not the only Catholicos during the time. According to the chart, there were three other individuals who were appointed to be the official Catholicos, but who obviously were not accepted. Then you can see for the Armenian kings, well, for a short time we don't have any more king. For a while we won't have any more kings. The last Armenian king, indigenous king, was Ardashes IV, and after him we have imperial Iranian governors, or Marspans. So if we go down to the next, the next, you can look at this on your own. I don't mean to go too quickly. As you can see here, the middle of the century, this big line of red lettering, the exact middle of the fifth century was very momentous across the Christian world. So for the Armenian kings or Armenian secular leaders, patriarchs, and for the Iranian king of kings, the big thing was the Battle of Abarid and the problems that associated with that. And for the Western world, the big thing was the Council of Chalcedon. But again, I won't go too depth into it now. Suffice it to say, a lot of changes, a lot of big things. And of course, the Roman emperor, or at this point, the Byzantine emperor, there were three emperors in the years 474. And over in Armenia, there were six individuals who governed as the imperial Iranian governor in 2 years. Six people in 2 years. That's not a very usual turnover. And then, of course, rather interestingly, at the very end of the fifth century, every single leader effectively bleeds out from the fifth into the sixth century. So much like with Saint Sahag the first, everyone who is in a position of power and responsibility just carries over into the next century. So there's a little bit of stability at the end. But again, you can look at this chart on your own time. So now, whoops, I'm sorry. Hold on. One moment. Okay, there we go. All righty. Now let us begin properly. So, if you'll recall from last week, I called the fourth century of the fourth century a formative century for the Armenian Church. This is no less the case than for the fifth century. So let's just have a little bit of an introduction, some images. Here we, of course, see Saint Mesrob Marshdots. This image comes from a manuscript of the grammar book of Simeon of Julfa. And actually, this image comes from a manuscript from the year 1776. Okay. This one is an icon from the cathedral, the Armenian cathedral in Buenos Aires in Argentina. So obviously the big first main event of the 5th century was the creation of the Armenian alphabet. Then, of course, in this lower region, we have the coins of the Byzantine Emperor Marcian. Yeah, Marcian, who was, of course, responsible for the convening of the Council of Chalcedon, in which the main issues were the lingering effects of the Nestorian heresy, as well as, more specifically, the Eutychian heresy. And we'll get into that later on. This, of course, is another imperial coin, but from a very different empire. This, of course, being the image of the Iranian King of Kings, Yazdegerd II. And it was during his tenure as Iranian emperor that the opening battle of Avarar was first fought, and the struggle, which was begun at Avarar, would continue until nearly the end of the 5th century. So, but first, a very, very quick summary of the 4th century, and this is just the image from last week's presentation. So, in the 4th century, we had the very beginning of the conversion of Armenia to Christianity and the start of the initial processes, including the incorporation, in many cases, of the pagan clergy into the church, as well as the perpetuation of property rights. So the pagan clergy, who by right owned the estates that were dedicated to the pagan cults, were able to keep their properties, but those properties were given to the church, and those clergy were to become Christian clergy. The hierarchy of the Armenian church in this time was just beginning, and following the natural indigenous pattern of government in Armenia, noble houses, the church was attached not to big cities, but to houses. So, for example, you'd have the bishop of the house of the Mamagonians, the bishop of the royal house, and so on and so forth. And of course, in this very early period, you see little inklings of the mechanism of the church council. But of course, this developed from the political pattern of Armenia, in which the nobles would come together in council to discuss issues of policy and national importance. And of course, in time, this came to include the Christian clergy. From the previous leadership chart, we see at least inklings of the difficulties that the early church Catholicos has had with their own army, the own kings, the Roman emperors, and the Iranian shahs. Now, I didn't show this, but this was also sent out in the email. A lot of the Armenian kings, if you'll notice, share dates of their kingship with the Roman emperors. And very often time when the Eastern Roman emperors were Arians, usually the Armenian kings were Arians because they were more often clients of the Roman emperors. And so obviously that would not go over very well with the Armenian clergy. And of course, this was responsible for conflicts between the early Catholicoses and the Armenian kings. And of course, from last week, we remember the Hrypsimians, Hrypsime, Gaiane, and the other nuns from Rome were responsible for converting Armenia and Georgia. And of course, Georgia was converted through the nun Nune, who survived the massacre of Hrypsime and her companions. And Armenian Christianity was influenced from three principal sources, namely Jerusalem and the Judaic type of Christianity, Syriac Christianity from the south, and Greek Christianity from the west. So this is where we left off from last week. And so this week we have some slightly different issues. So why is the 5th century a formative century? Well, I'll get to that in a second. Armenians and their civilization become lettered. They officially join the ranks of civilizations that have an indigenous alphabet for their own language, which is, of course, the beginning of an indigenous literature. And specifically, this is also the time when we begin to see the records of what Christianity looks like as seen and experienced by Armenians. And of course, the creation of the alphabet and the development of early Armenian literature was all part of the larger process of conversion, of becoming Christians, but in such a way as best suited Armenians. So not as it is suited the experiences of the Greeks or the Syriacs or this and that. Um, and of course, this helps the process of conversion and begins to really, in a very substantial way, displace the old Zoroastrian faith, which is not to say that there were still many people in Armenia, Nakharars and peasants and so forth, who weren't Zoroastrians. They were, but Christianity is becoming, it's becoming the new norm, if I may so use that expression. Actually, and one of our writers uses the term ancestral tradition to talk about Christianity. This would be Yerishe the historian. Furthermore, universal Christian fraternity begins really to fray in earnest, and you start to see splinters and cracks in the church on a very large and more permanent level than we've seen in previous centuries. And of course, not one century after the initial conversion, the Armenian church already begins to face crises. Not one crisis, but multiple crises. There are endings and new beginnings which depart already from the precedents established in the last century. So the main topics of 5th century history, as I've come to understand it, is the continued process of conversion. Now, I want to read from one of the sources. Yeah, part of this, obviously, part of this process of conversion is the creation of the alphabet and the ability of the Armenians to translate the scriptures as well as any other literature into the Armenian language. Now, one of the principal sources of this era is the biography of Saint Mesrop Mashdots, written by one of his students, Goryun. Now, in this biography or saint's life, Goryun has a very interesting sentence, and I'd like to read that. I find I'm not exactly sure why. It's very heartwarming and kind of poetic. At that time, our blessed and wonderful land of Armenia became truly worthy of admiration, where, by the hands of two colleagues, suddenly, in an instant, Moses, the lawgiver, along with the order of the prophets, energetic Paul, with the entire phalanx of the apostles, along with Christ's world-sustaining gospel, became Armenian speaking, end quote. So it's like the gospel was right there all along, but finally they became intelligible in a way that the Armenians could understand. So this was just part of the process of conversion, a tool of evangelization, so to speak. Additionally, this is also part of the process of making the Armenian church more independent in a way. It's a natural consequence of the alphabet, being able to utilize the thought patterns and ideas inherent in Armenian language and in Armenian cultural expressions to create a unique witness and experience of Christ that is different, not necessarily better, but different from Greek and Syriac Christianities. That is both influenced by those two, but not dependent on them. And of course, hierarchically, the Armenians are distinct from both imperial churches, both within the West, centered at Rome and Constantinople, as well as the imperial church that's tolerated in imperial Iran. And it's also distinct from the Syrian church that occasionally gets Iranian imperial backing. Additionally, we have a lot of councils of Christendom, and again, fraying fraternal relationships often emanating from those. And of course, the existential crises, which include the loss of the Armenian kingdom officially, the disruption of the Catholical lineage, the potential loss, real loss of faith entirely, uh, Iranian imperialism, and of course, war. And I'll get into those details later. So, uh, mm, timeline of the this is a timeline of the 5th century, a very very brief timeline. So we see a lot of momentous events going on at once. The actual invention of the alphabet took within the span of about a year or so, but the work that followed from that took several decades. And coterminous with that period of time was also other developments in terms of thought, Christology, and so forth. And within that time, other events were also going. So a lot of events happened um, simultaneously and overlapping. One thing started, and another thing, and so on and so forth. So, of course, 428 is one of the big years. This should be right up there with 1375 for the end of Armenian political independence. In 428, the Armenian kingdom was abolished after the final king was ousted by the Iranian government. And likewise, Catholicos Sahag was deposed from his office for a time, even though he was eventually restored in limited capacity. And then, of course, we have a couple of wars, some councils, and a rather interesting document produced out of the Byzantine East, or the West for us. But anyway, so I would like to point out tonight that excuse me, I would like to mention, however, that for tonight, given the uh, complexity and depth required to go into all this history properly, tonight, time permitting, I will probably focus mostly on the creation of the alphabet and the missionary activity and translation work that followed that. And I'll get into the political details in greater depth next week. So sit back and enjoy, I think, a nice trip with Mesrov Mashtots as he works to make Paul, Moses, and Christ Armenian speaking. So, the main sources for the 5th century come principally from four sources. As I mentioned before, Goryun and his biography of his teacher, Mesrov Mashtots, in his book, The Life of Mashtots. And this is the principal source for at least the first third of the 5th century. And so I'll be following that narrative most closely. Then we have the history of Vartan and the Armenian War, written by Yerishe. And again, we also have the history of the Armenians by Movses Khorenatsi, who I discussed last week. And then finally, we have the history of the Armenians, written by Ghazar Parpetsi. That would be Lazarus of Parpet. And actually, what's interesting about that last book is that Ghazar wrote under the patronage of Vahan Mamagonian. This would be, I believe, Vartan Mamagonian's nephew. I'll have to double check that. Okay. All righty. So I think we'll begin with just a very, very brief sketch of Mesrov Mashtots' life. So he was born in the middle of the 4th century, and his initial career was in the service of the Armenian king. So he was a secretary, and he worked very closely. He was also a soldier, and in the second half of his life, he received a calling and gave up the official life in favor of a more monastic one, or of an ascetical life. He gathered pupils around him and would go out and preach. He would go out to neighboring regions in Armenia, to those areas that had not been converted yet, and just preach. The problem was that the only way that people could understand anything about Christianity was with a knowledge of the Syriac language or the Greek language. Now, I'd like to recall a moment from last week's class in the epic histories. In the epic histories, that was another book from last week. We learn from that text that following the lead of King Tiran, many people throughout Armenia were not following Christianity properly. They considered it as some human religion, and quote, they did not receive it with understanding as is fitting, with hope and faith, but only those who were to some degree acquainted with Greek or Syriac learning were able to achieve some partial inkling of it. As for those who were without skill in learning and who were the great mass of the people, the Nakharars as well as the peasantry, even had spiritual teachers sat day and night pouring the abundance of their teaching over their heads. Not one of them could keep in mind a single thing of what he heard. Not a word, not half a word, not a minimal record, not a trace. And so again, Mesrop Mashtots, literally a half a century later, came up basically with the exact same problem. He was trying to communicate the faith, but just did not have the technical, well, for lack of a better word, the technology to do it properly. He couldn't speak their language. He couldn't communicate, and he would have had to do on the spot translations, which not particularly helpful if you're trying to evangelize people. And so, necessity is the mother of invention. Basically, the earlier problem from half a century earlier reared its head again. And even though Catholicos Saint Nerses I had set up schools in Greek and Syriac, that obviously proved not to be a lasting solution. Yeah. Okay. So, upon realizing this, Mesrop Mashtots, pictured here in the center, appealed to his spiritual father, to the Catholicos, naturally, who also had been concerned about this very issue. That, well, of course, he would have been concerned with it. He was the chief pastor for all of Armenia. It would have been within his purview to be concerned about such a thing. And so both of them appealed to the king of Armenia, Vramshapu, about their concern, and they wanted to do something about it. And it just so happens that King Vramshapu happened to hear of a certain Syrian bishop by the name of Daniel, who, as luck would have it, just happened to have a spare Armenian alphabet lying on his desk. I'm exaggerating, of course, but suffice it to say, we learn that in Koryun's biography of Mesrop Mashtots, that a certain Syrian bishop did actually have a script. I don't remember where precisely I read this. I think it might have been that this bishop was under Armenian authority and had been working on his just independently for an alphabet. Something to that effect, but don't take me at my word on that point. Suffice it to say, there was a bishop of Syrian origin to the south who did have an alphabet. So Vramshapu sent a certain person by the name of Vahrij, probably a high-ranking soldier or like a colonel or something, as a servant of the royal court. He sent this Vahrij down to the Bishop Daniel to meet up with the priest Habel, who I'm assuming was also a Syriac priest, to collect the letters and bring it back to test. And when Mesrop and Sahag tested the alphabet on some children in the area, they found it wasn't good enough. It was based on, I believe, an Aramaic model, which is a Semitic language, and it just wasn't sufficient for Armenian. So they all realized that they needed to travel abroad to study other scripts and other alphabets to work out a proper system. Vramshapu ordered Mashtots and some students to go, and Sahag gave his approval. They traveled first to Syrian cities to the south, to Edessa and to Amida. Now, let me see. Okay, yeah, here. I have a couple of maps here. Let me go to, here we are. This is a better one. Actually, wait. Ignore those images before. I'll get to those later. So we have, if you can see my mouse, I'm circling it around sort of the top right where it says Varar Shapat, Artaxata, and Devine, right near Lake Sevan. So this is roughly where the Armenian royal court would have been. And so Mesrob Mashtots and his disciples first traveled south all the way, where are we? South and southwest down to here, Edessa. If you can see my mouse moving in a circle. And also here to Amida on the Roman side of the border between Rome, the Byzantine Empire, and the Iranian Empire. I'll get to that momentarily. Why they were able to cross the border between stalwart enemies. Anyway, Amida and Edessa was where Mesrob and his students traveled first. And they also had students sent from those places also to Samosata here. And the students were required to learn Syriac and Greek in order to be able to be trained for translation work. Eventually, Mesro Mashtots himself went to Samosata and consulted with a Greek scribe named Rufinus. And together, they devised the essential pictures, the letters that would eventually become the Armenian alphabet. And these wound up proving to be the letters that were workable. And of course, the famous first sentence translated into Armenian comes from the book of Proverbs, chapter 1, verse 2. Janachel zimastutun yevishrad, imanal ispanis hanjaro, which effectively means to know wisdom and instruction or guidance, to understand words of understanding. And one might say that this was effectively this was precisely the reason that they were involved in this work, to make the scriptures available to their own people. Literally, wisdom, instruction, and words of understanding. And initially, just to further test these letters, two of the students with Mesrov Mashtots, named Hovsep and Hovhan, were asked to translate the book of Proverbs entirely, just as a test case. Yeah. Okay. Now, I'm going to go back because I want to spend a little bit of time on the actual alphabet itself. Now, I have to give credit where credit is due. What I'm about to tell you about the letters comes direct from the time that I spent taking this class with Dr. Irvin last year. So you may thank her for this as well. Now, you'll notice there are 4 columns to the alphabet. Each column consists of 9 letters, making a total of 36 letters. This has very practical usage because if you'll notice very carefully, well, actually, if anyone has been to St. Vartan Cathedral in Manhattan, on the corner of 2nd Avenue and 35th Street, there's a stone in the wall on the street level that has on one side an image of an Armenian cross, and on the other side there are some Armenian letters. Those letters are the symbols of numbers, and the Armenian letters, like many letters in antiquity, were used for calculating numbers as well as for writing out words. So this system is extremely elegant because you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and you can make those into multiples. So Aip is 1, Te is 9, and then you start again at Je, 10, 20, 30, 40, and so on and so forth, into the hundreds and thousands. So that's one extremely practical use of the alphabet. But more important than this has to do with the shape and the meaning of three particular letters. And this is again why, extremely uniquely, Armenian is very much a Christian alphabet. And yeah, why the Armenian alphabet is a deliberately Christian alphabet, and again was used as a tool for evangelization and conversion. So this first letter down here, the bottom left, this is the letter E. It is the seventh letter of the alphabet. Now, the E, well, first of all, the number 7 was extremely important in antiquity, being the number of completeness or perfection. Furthermore, the E in Armenian is not just a letter, it is also a word. It is specifically the third person singular of the verb, of one of the verbs to be. So he, she, it is. This is also the name which God gives himself in the book of Exodus when he tells his name to Moses. Yes, yesem vor e. I am the one who is. The E, in other words, is a letter which is its own name. This one little letter basically means God, or God just is. He exists. So built into the Armenian alphabet is the confession, is the conviction that yes, we absolutely know that God is. We may not be able to perceive him precisely, we may not be able to know him exactly, but we have unshakable faith that God is, that he's there, that he knows us, he loves us, and so on and so forth. So that's the first of the three letters in the original 36 letter alphabet. The second letter, if up here the top left, is a lowercase a, the IP. Now, this is another confession of Christian theology. If you'll notice, it has 1, 2, 3 vertical strokes, all connected at the bottom with one horizontal stroke. In other words, we not only do we confess God as existing with the letter E, but we further confess that God is Trinity. So whenever you write the IP, which is the first letter for the word God, Astvads, you're saying that God is Trinity, even without saying a word, just by writing the letter. And then we have the third letter, which is the last of the original 36 letters, K. Now, this is one of 2 Ks. What we have in English for K, we have at least 2 of those in Armenian. This is the K and either the Kim or the Gen, depending on whether you're Eastern or Western Armenian. The shape of the K, however, comes from, well, actually, that comes from the Greek west, from the Greek world. The first 2 letters in Greek of the word Christ are chi and ro, which appear up at the top right corner of your screen, right here. Which of course looks like an English X and an English P, but of course it's more like a hard K and the R. Very famous in the Western Christian world, both the Roman West and the Byzantine East, but it's West for us. This is this symbol, the Christogram, which basically combines the chi and the ro together into one symbol. This is the inspiration for the letter K for us, as you'll notice. So embedded in the Armenian alphabet, in the very structure of the Armenian alphabet, we have 3 confessions of faith. 1, that we believe that God is, that he exists, that we know him, and he knows us. Moreover, that he is Trinity. He is 1 in 3, or however you wish to express it. And within those three, there is one in particular who has brought our salvation. So every time you write in Armenian letters, you are writing especially with these three letters, a confession of faith in Christ, which is absolutely fascinating. I don't know what other civilization can literally boast that in their alphabet they have confessions of faith. It's pretty remarkable. Okay. Now that I've gone on at length about that, we can continue with the narrative. Okay. All right. So back to the map. Mm-hmm. So after Mesrop Mashtots completed the creation of the alphabet, he returned to Armenia and resumed his work with evangelization, specifically in the biography of Mashtots, the region of Mark. And then afterwards, he, along with Saint Sahag, proceeded to establish educational institutions, schools, monastic foundations within Armenia, and also to begin the work of translation, not just the scriptures, but everything else available. Now, what's curious is that in the life of Mashtots, Goryun feels the need to justify this work. Let me see if I can find the exact section. Okay, it's a tiny bit long, but I think it's worth reading. So this is chapter 11 from the life of Mashtots. And from then on, continuing with the husbandry of God's work, they began with the evangelical art to translate, to write, and to teach, especially since they had before their eyes the Lord's lofty commands and God's lofty commands, which were given to blessed Moses concerning all things that were, so as to be inscribed in a book to be preserved for the eternity to come, as well as similar commands which had been given to other prophets. Quote, "Take thee a great roll," he said, and write in it with a scribe's pen. And elsewhere, "Now go, write it on a tablet and inscribe it in a book." But David indicates even more clearly that the divine law shall apply to all nations by saying, quote, "This shall be written for the generation to come," and quote, "The Lord shall count when he writeth up the people, which in his coming Christ fulfilled by his gracious commandment, go ye therefore and teach all nations. And that, quote, this gospel shall be preached in all the world," end quote. Thus, our blessed fathers, referring to Sahag and Mesrop, having obtained permission, rendered their work through hopeful endeavor manifest and fruitful as the gospel. So, in that paragraph in the life of Mashtots, Goryun felt the need, well, obviously, he felt the need to say that it wasn't just for the heck of it that they were doing this, but that the scriptures themselves say you should write these things down, you should write them, you should get them out, communicate them. And so they were perfectly in line with what they were taught to do. Okay. Continuing on, Sahag and Mashtos gather students from all across Armenian territories, which is this whole area here under, actually, wait, let me go back a little bit. Yeah. If you can see on this map, the orange section known as Pers Armenia or Persian Armenia. This is principally where, well, this is most of Armenia in the 5th century, and of course there were also some Armenians here a little bit further to the west on the Roman side of the border. So, but throughout this general region, Mesro Mashtots and Sahag gathered students. Sahag, Catholico Sahag personally undertook the instruction of the Mamagonian family, the family who was the hereditary commander-in-chief of the Armenian army, because he was related to them. And he was also in charge of educating the army and the royal court. Mesrop Mashtots continued to evangelize in other pagan regions and gather pupils. And very curiously, if anyone is familiar with the name Vasak Sunetsi or Vasak Suni, for in Armenian history, he's effectively, well, let me put it this way. Mata Hari and Benedict Arnold ain't got nothing on Vasak Suni by comparison. The original Ark trader, second only to Judas. However, in the life of Mashtots, he makes an appearance. Quote, where is it? Yeah. At that time, God ordained that brave Vasak Suni, a wise and ingenious, far-sighted man, endowed with the grace of divine knowledge, came to be the ruler of Sunik. He greatly assisted in the work of evangelization. He showed obedience as a son to his father, and duly serving the gospel, carried out all his requests. So Vasak Suni, the arch traitor, not, what is it, 2 decades prior to Avarar, was a shining beacon. My, how things change. But again, we'll get into that next week in more detail. In chapter 15 of Mashtots's life, we find that Mesrop Mashtots was also involved in the invention of the Georgian alphabet. He took more pupils and evangelized in Georgia with the consent of the ruling authorities and the bishops in Georgia, of course. After this time, we learn that Mashtots then continued on to Western Armenia, the part of Armenia that was under Roman or Byzantine control. Oh, okay. Now, I probably should have pointed this out earlier, but I think that this is just as good of a place to indicate this. I mentioned earlier, actually, we can even use this map here. I mentioned earlier that for the ancient world, one of the big rivalries was the Roman Empire against the Iranian Empire, the Sasanian dynasty. In this map, this is from the 4th century, but it's still relevant. We have here the journey, the campaign trail of the Emperor Julian in his attempt to attack the Sassanians and regain a strong Roman foothold in the Near East. He failed, and he was actually killed in battle during this war, and his successor had to sign a humiliating peace treaty. However, in the late 4th century, early 5th century, we learn that the tension between Rome and Iran was actually calm. And there's a great reason for this. The Iranian king of kings at the time, this would be Yazdegerd I, and he reigned from 399 to 420. He was extremely well known for his mercy, for his mercy. Specifically, at one point, the Romans were facing multiple crises. There was a band of barbarians attacking the Balkans, the southeastern part of Europe. There was another group of barbarians in the area of present-day France who were in rebellion. There was a civil war going on, and the eastern provinces, Armenia and Asia Minor, were revolting. So Yazdegerd, seeing all of this, did not actually take advantage of the situation, but actually returned Christian Roman captives from war. And based on this goodwill of the emperor, of the Iranian emperor, the Byzantine emperor of the time, Arcadius, realized this and knew that his young son, who would become the Emperor Theodosius II, was in danger. And so the Byzantine emperor, in his will, appointed the Iranian emperor to be the guardian and caretaker of his son. So that's just fascinating. Um, Moreover, Yazdegerd I took up that responsibility and wrote to the Roman Senate saying that if anyone made trouble against the child, uh, he would take action. So effectively, there was a great deal of peace along this border, along this border, along this border, based on the kindness and mercy of one individual with immense power. So this I think greatly explains one of the reasons that Mesro Mashtots was able to travel between the border so freely. Um, this would not last, however, but I'll get to that in a minute. No, actually, I'll get to that now. In the year 420, this beneficence of Yazdegerd came to an end. And actually, it had nothing to do with Rome, but had more to do with the behavior of Persian Christians under his authority. We learned that there were some overzealous Persian Christians who behaved in a less than Christian manner. And I'm quoting here from an article about Yazdegerd, committed such offensive acts such as the destruction of Zoroastrian fire temples, theft of property deeds, slandering of the Mazdaean, that is Zoroastrian faith, and disobedience to royal orders. So effectively, there were some Christians in the Persian Empire who got overzealous and were disrespectful, disruptive, and in certain cases a little destructive of the Zoroastrian establishment in Iran. And so Yazdegerd reversed his policies of tolerance and responded with persecutions of his Christians. So this made the relations, this soured the relations and made travel a little bit more difficult. Okay. Continuing onward. Oh, yeah. So during the time, however, of good relations between the two empires, Mashtots took some pupils with him and left them in the care of the bishop of this city here, Melitene. Now, the bishop of Melitene at this time was Acacius of Melitene. And from Melitene, he took an even smaller group to Constantinople. And in Constantinople, they sought permission from the emperor to use the new Armenian script, and they had to get the Byzantine emperor's permission because it was created in well, with the consultation of Syrians, and closer to the Persian border than it was from the Greek world. Now, this bishop Acacius was actually, no, I won't get into that now. I'll get into that more later. But suffice it to say, he would play a role in the development of doctrine a couple of decades down the road. Additionally, Mesro Mashtots created an alphabet for, not just for the Georgians, but also for their immediate eastern neighbors, the Caucasian Albanians, or the Aryuank. So Mesro Mashtots, according to this biography, was responsible for the creation of 3 alphabets. So he was a very busy Vartabed. And actually, we still remember Mesro Mashtots as the archetype of Vartabeds. That's how he's remembered and how we celebrate him on his feast day. While in Constantinople, some of the disciples of Mesrop Mashtots collected some books as well as canons of councils. Mm-hmm. Oh, let me. Okay. So when they returned to Armenia, we learn well, a couple of things. First, that the bishop of Caucasian Albania, named Jeremiah, also undertook very similar work to what Sahag and Mesrop Mashtots were doing, which was, quote, translation of the divine books, whereby at once, in one instant, the barbaric, slothful, and brutal men became well acquainted with the prophets and the apostles, becoming heirs to the gospel and in no way ignorant of the divine traditions. Which actually was very similar to a line from the history of Agathangelos from the previous century. It's the same kind. It's the same kind of thing. For Agathangelos, it was co-opting the pagan clergy to be Christian priests. In this case, it was evangelizing the Caucasian Albanians, sort of at the outset. Okay. Part of the translation work that they undertook, Mesrop and Sahag, was to send pupils again to the various cities, to Edessa, and to the Greek regions to collect books of Greek fathers, Syriac fathers, and make copies of them, and then translate those books into Armenian. So some of the students that we know of who went to these various cities are Hovsep. We have Yeznik of Kolp, which is, I don't think it's on this map, but it would have been in this area in the Ararat province. This was the royal province. So Kolp would have been a village in this area. We also have Revont and Gorion himself, and they went to Constantinople and were later joined by Yeznig to collect Greek works as well as councils, canons of the councils of Nicaea and Ephesus. Okay. I'm coming to the end now, but just a few final words on this part of the 5th century. This is, well, as I said at the beginning, the main events of the 5th century overlap and had ramifications for each other. So part of the translation work and part of the invention of the Armenian alphabet involved consulting with Syriac Christians. Now, at this time, there was a certain bishop named Theodore, who, if you can see here off to the left of the screen on this map, there's Adana, and just to the east, there's another city called Mopsuestia. If you can see it right here, I'm making a circle with the mouse. Theodore of Mopsuestia was a very prolific writer. He produced commentaries, treatises, so on and so forth. And one of his students was none other than the Archbishop of Constantinople, Nestorius, who also would come to be viciously vilified, as the creator of one of the biggest heresies, Nestorianism. Say effectively that there are, I'm probably gonna botch this, so I'll get into greater depth in this next week. Effectively, two Christs who like share a body or something to that effect. Effectively, he was taking the teaching of the school of Antioch, again down here, right where it says Mediterranean Sea, the sort of bottom left of the map here. Antioch was a major Christian center for Christian learning, and their tradition often emphasized the duality of Christ, that they shouldn't be mixed too close, that there was a distinct divinity and humanity to Christ. And the stories just took it way, way too far. But uh, we know that Armenians were not necessarily closed off to the Syrian, Antiochian type of learning and thinking. One example of this is the structure of our prayers. Now, our Bishop Daniel, wrote an article for the journal for St. Nerses Seminary. I won't get into detail about that. I'm just going to highlight one particular point that he makes in it, namely that for a lot or a great number of Armenian church prayers, it's what could be called a double prayer. So you have, for example, O Lord our God, you are this, this, and this. We thank you, we bless you, and we ask you for X, Y, and Z. Now and always, glory to the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen. Then the priest will turn around and do a blessing. And then he'll begin another prayer. O Lord our God, you are this, this, and this, and this, and so on and so on and so forth. And he'll end with another Amen. This double prayer structure comes from Antioch, from the Antiochian tradition. And of course, being in Syriac cities, when Mesro Mashtots went on his initial journey to create the alphabet, did consult with Syriacs. That's just a fact. So, however, in this time, that's roughly the 430s, late 420s, or 430s and 440s, because of the trouble caused by Nestorius, as well as by the rivalry between the Antiochian tradition and the tradition of the city of Alexandria in Egypt. Let me see if I have that. Yeah. So Antioch here, if you can see, I'm moving the mouse. And down here in Alexandria, two major centers of Christian learning with different traditions and different emphases in what they believed and practiced, but whose principal bishops and proponents eventually developed a very, very intense rivalry. And this would go on to fuel controversies for the next several decades at the very least. So in this time, Theodore of Mopsuestius' writings were becoming a little bit problematic. And as I'll get into next week in more detail, there's evidence of this being not only present in Armenia, but slightly problematic. Okay, and I'll end first with a mention, and I'll mention this again next week. I'm going to end with a particular church council that took place in the Armenian world. In the year 444, there took place the Council of Shahapivan. Now that would have been in the royal barracks, again, probably in the Ararat region around here. And this was all the canons of this council had to do with Christian practice, of putting what one learns in the scriptures and making it actionable, how one lives it out in life, in specific areas, the conduct of clergy, issues of marriage, and other things. And we learn from most of the sources for the 5th century that one of the students of Mesro Mashtots, named Hovsep, was elected chief of the council. So he was the first successor after Saint Sahag, the first legitimate successor. But I don't want to go too much further in depth on that. I'll get into more detail about that next week. So with that, I want to conclude today's lecture, and I hope I've given a good summary, not too broad, but not too convoluted, to gain an idea of this rather important part of Armenian church history. So thank you very much.